Our modern world looks at the origin of the universe and we see a cosmic accident and perpetual conflict. Everything kind of came through some sort of explosion. We can't quite figure out the other end of it. But what happened since then is what Charles Darwin called the survival of the fittest. Is that there's constant conflict from different organisms and animals, and whoever is the strongest or whoever is able to get the most, they eventually are the ones that we now see through the evolutionary process. The world is just built around accidents and conflict. And we've now taken that and we've applied that to our social world, right? Where I need to get ahead. I need to be more productive than the next guy. I need to continue to strive and to work. And so we've applied Darwinism now to our productivity and to our bottom lines and to how we think about and interact with people in our neighborhoods. You see, the productivity-driven world that we live in is actually a reflection of a belief about the origin of the universe. And so in the same way, our Sabbath keeping, right, when we take time to stop and to rest and to worship God and to enjoy life with Him, is actually our theology, our belief about God embodied in our rhythms and our calendar.
On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave some to his companions?" Then he told them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." That'll be our word for today. You may be seated.
All right, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. Look at verses 23 through 28 this morning as we continue our series, Unhurried Jesus, looking at the practice of pace, one of the 6 practices of discipleship here at Wingfoot Church. While you're turning there, I don't know if you saw this or not, but last year there was a global experiment in 200 workplaces around the world. So all different continents, all different types of workplaces. The experiment was this. They were testing the 32-hour work week. I don't know if you saw this, the 32-hour work week. So the experiment was this. For 6 months, companies had to adopt a 4-day work week for their full-time employees without reducing their pay or their benefits. Sounds kind of nice, right? You can find the list of those 200 companies and maybe apply for a job. But they tested this, and there's actually an RV company in Willoughby, about an hour north of here. They make what they call the Mercedes-Benz of the RV world. I don't know what that means, but that sounds pretty nice. But they manufacture these, and they take time. Like, they can only produce so many in a given year. But this company opted to try out this experiment. So for 6 months, they scheduled their employees, all their employees, to only work 4 days a week. The CEO, after that experiment, came back and reflected on it in the interview and in the response, and they found that in reducing their employees' work hours by 25%, they still maintained a productivity level of around 90% of what they had done previously. So a whole day was given up, and yet only about 10% of productivity dropped. And he said one of the things that they found was that people actually found ways to become more efficient in their work. With the 4 days that they had, they found trips, tricks, and tips for how they found ways to work. My gosh. Let's start over. Hi, I'm John. All right. They found ways, tricks to kind of not cut corners like with quality, but like to become more efficient in their work week. And in this experiment, all 41 of the companies in North America, not a single one of them went back to the 40-hour work week. Because productivity maintained the same, but employee morale and employee health actually only improved. And so people wanted to stay longer, and so they got better at the work that they did in the time that they worked for these companies. You see, what they were discovering in this modern experiment is what the Bible and the way of Jesus have known all along, is that there's a healthy rhythm between work and rest. There's a direct connection between how much we work and how much we rest and how effective we are at the work that we do. That just simply working more hours, longer and harder does not actually produce any more results, but that when we actually take time to slow down and to rest and put boundaries on our work, what happens is that we become better at our work. We become more creative at our work. We become more effective at our work when we take time to stop and to rest and to be present and to be human. You see, this is the wisdom of the practice of the Sabbath. And that's what we're going to look at this morning and next week, is how the Bible teaches us to practice Sabbath. Now, you might be new to this idea of Sabbath. You may have encountered someone and they say, "Oh, I'm practicing Sabbath." And you're like, "What kind of new diet trend is that?" Right? What does that actually mean? Right? What is the Sabbath? Here's a working definition that we're going to work on for what the Sabbath is. The Sabbath is a 24-hour period of time every 7 days in which we stop working, rest, worship God, and enjoy life with Him. 24 hours, once a week, in which we do 4 things. We stop working, we rest, we worship God, and we enjoy life with Him. I mean, just think about the freedom that some of us feel this weekend, because we know that tomorrow is not another day of work. I know some of us are working, and some of us have that, but there's a certain, you look forward to that weekend, and you're ready for it, because there's that extra day where you can enjoy life. You can be with your family. You can sit at the pool, whatever the thing is, right? Imagine feeling that every single week. That's the invitation of the Sabbath. Now, in our world, we have 2 wrong approaches to this practice of the Sabbath. The first wrong approach is what we see in the story here between Jesus and the Pharisees. You look at Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 23. The first wrong approach is that Sabbath keeping is about rule keeping. You'll notice that Jesus and his disciples were walking through the grain fields, and they are picking some heads of grain. This would be the equivalent of you're walking through a park and you find some berries. After checking to know that they're not poisonous, you enjoy some. You eat some. They're doing that. They're walking on the Sabbath day, and so they take this and they eat this. But the Pharisees, this group of religious experts who are watching Jesus' every move already, they call Jesus out on that, and they say, "Why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" You see, the Pharisees' concern with the Sabbath was whether or not you were doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And they have some good reason to have that mindset, because after all, the Sabbath is one of the big 10 commandments in the Old Testament. Right? Think, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Also, remember the Sabbath. Take this day to rest and to not work. And so this isn't just like some sort of minute detail in the Old Testament. This is a big issue. In fact, there's some experts on the Old Testament that point to the fact that probably Israel's failure to follow the Sabbath command in the Old Testament is one of the primary reasons why God eventually exiled them. And the Pharisees knew that. And so their concern was, we need to make sure we protect the Sabbath. We need to make sure we follow the rules on the Sabbath, because we don't want that to happen again to us. And so they're very concerned about what you do and what you do not do on this day. There's a rule, there's a prohibition against harvesting on the Sabbath in the Old Testament. And so if you pick a few heads of grain, the question is, how many heads of grain until you're harvesting? That's their mindset. I need to make sure I'm in the box and following the rules. Now, how we then tend to think about Sabbath, though, is kind of the opposite. Our modern approach to Sabbath is that the Sabbath is outdated and inefficient. Right? We look at that and we say, that would be nice, but I have too many things to do. That would be nice, but I have too much work to do. That would be nice, but I have lots of things to work at on my house or on my property or on my car. I have too much to do. You see, about 100 years ago, we had in our country what we called blue laws. What were called blue laws, which was like on Sunday, there were some things that you literally legally could not do. You couldn't go shopping in the morning. The movie theater didn't open until like 2, if that at best. All right, there was this kind of social structure around us that reinforced or at least encouraged a little bit of slowing down on Sunday morning. The reason why you can't buy alcohol on Sunday morning until 11 a.m. is the last remaining blue law here in Ohio. And so lots of people were kind of forced into this rest, but there really wasn't a whole lot of thought about why am I doing this? Right? There's sort of this assumption, but the world that we live in now, it says not only are we going to get rid of all those laws, but we're going to get rid of any rest whatsoever. One study found that employees today are 480% more productive than they were in 1940. 480%. We're putting out 480% more work, more output than we did in the 1940s. And yet what we're finding is employees are working longer hours now than we did then, even with all the innovations of technology and productivity and efficiency. 41% of employees work more than 45 hours a week. One estimate is that the average worker gives about 9 unpaid hours of overtime to their employer every single week. Or you're just clocking in hours because you got to get it done. And remote work, with how much freedom and potential work-life balance that tends to offer, the more you work remotely, the more likely it is that you are overworking. About 50% of remote workers are working more than 50 hours a week. See, the reality is that we've gotten rid of the laws, and what we replaced it with is this whole sense of I've got to do more. I've got to be more productive. I've got to be more working and harder and faster and longer. But the science is showing that we can work all we want, but at some point you are only producing so much. In fact, they've done deep studies on this, and they found that after about 50 hours of work in a given week, you will work about the same as someone who works 70 hours in a week. So if you work 70 hours a week, you will complete as much as someone who works 50 hours a week. That 20 hours that you're working over does nothing. You're not producing anymore. You are as efficient and as effective as someone who's working 70 hours a week. Not to mention 32 hours a week. And the reality is we're struggling. Where's all this time going? 35% of people who are surveyed in this said that all that time is going into email and internet and social media. And so we're working, but we're kind of not really working. And if you're a remote worker, you feel this pressure from your employees because you're working at home to clock in more hours. So 60% of remote workers said, yeah, I gotta work beyond my limits because my boss or my employee is looking in at me. You see, we've replaced all the rules and the regulations that we look at as kind of outdated or outmoded or kind of weird and dumb, and we've replaced it with new rules and new regulations. Just now the rules and regulations are about work, about how much time I put in, about how much energy I'm expending for my boss or my employee or my resume or whatever. And we're sacrificing time with our families, sacrificing time for our own health, sacrificing time for God. So you notice Jesus' response to this controversy. Notice he doesn't first get into an argument with them about the rules around Sabbath. He doesn't start arguing and say, you know what, 5 grains of wheat is fine, but 6 grains of wheat, that's working on the Sabbath. He doesn't play the rules game when it comes to the Sabbath. But he also, on the other hand, doesn't say, you know what, I'm here. There's a new era that God is ushering in. It's the era of grace, not the law, and so don't worry about the Sabbath. No, what he does is he instead reinterprets or really returns us to the true meaning of the Sabbath. The true purpose of the Sabbath was not to make sure that you're following in on the rules and the regulations, but rather there's something deeper going on. There's a gift that God has in mind with the Sabbath. And he illustrates this with the story of David. In the story from 1 Samuel, David is on the run. He is anointed the next king of Israel, and so the current king of Israel obviously does not like that, and so he's chasing him down. And David and his men have been on the run, and they have not eaten, they have not rested, they have not slept. And David comes to the priest in the tabernacle, which would be the place where you met to worship God. And in the tabernacle, the Hebrews had this practice of taking the first fruits of the harvest, giving it to the priest, and then they would make bread out of it. And that bread would then every week be freshly placed before God and in the tabernacle as a first fruits kind of offering. They say, I'm giving God the best. I'm giving God the first fruits as a thankfulness offering to him. And this bread would sit there until it was about to go stale, and then the priest was allowed to consume it, but only the priest, because it was holy, sacred bread. But what Jesus points to is that when David has this need, when he's tired, when he's exhausted, and he comes into the tabernacle, and the priest gives him this bread, that is what the Sabbath is like. He's saying that the Sabbath is this day that is holy, that is sacred, that is special, that is reserved for God, but the actual benefit of the Sabbath, the actual purpose of the Sabbath, is that it meets our needs. It's not something that's like reserved on the shelf for only a few people, but that is actually God's purpose and plan that you and I would participate with God in the gift that is the Sabbath. And that the Sabbath actually meets a deep human need that we have. I mean, so many of us probably feel like David, just running ragged to get my to-do list done, to get my week done, to get my kids where they need to go, to get the things done that I need to get done on my house. That's where David is. And so Jesus says the Sabbath is this gift to you to rest and to know the goodness of God. And so Jesus gives us the true meaning of the Sabbath. He says Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath is this gift that God is giving you. It's not a straitjacket that he wants you to try to fit in. It's not a checklist that you have to make sure that you're doing the right things. It is instead an invitation to taste and see just how good God is, to experience how good the gift of life is, to actually know him as a father and as a friend and not as some religious or moral taskmaster, to actually rest in the goodness of who he is. And Jesus says that we will only know the true meaning of the Sabbath when we know it with him. That's why he says that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, meaning that he is the true purpose and the true point of the Sabbath is knowing him and resting in him and following him. That's when we will discover what it actually means to rest in God. And so here's the plan for what we're going to do over the next hour and a half. Now don't freak out because you're like, hour and a half, oh my goodness. This is going to be one sermon in two parts. All right, so this morning we're going to explore what is the gift of the Sabbath. And we're going to take the Sabbath out of the scriptures. We're just going to turn it around every single corner, every single angle to actually see how this gift is what our burnt out, worn out, exhausted, overly efficient world actually needs. And so we're going to look at from beginning to end of scripture, what does the Sabbath actually invite us into? And then next week, we're going to talk real specifically about then how can you begin to put this into practice in your life? In the 21st century, in Akron, wherever you are, whatever stage of life it is that you find yourself, how can you actually do this? Because the plan and purpose is that you would do this with Jesus. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to look through some scripture this morning. So if you have a Bible in front of you, it will also be on the screen as well. But we're going to look at 5 dimensions of the gift of the Sabbath that our worn out, burnt out, workaholic world desperately needs. So the first dimension of the gift of the Sabbath is this. The Sabbath keeping reflects God's goodness. It reflects God's goodness. The first time the word Sabbath ever appears in the Bible is Genesis chapter 2, on the heels of God creating everything. And Genesis 2 says this, on the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested, that's he Sabbathed, on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy or set apart, for on it he Sabbathed or rested from all his work of creation. See, the origin of the practice of Sabbath is God himself. This is not God saying, hey, I want you to do this and I'm going to watch you do it. This is something that God himself does. That after 6 days of creating, he takes an entire day and he rests and he enjoys the creation that he created. That his creation is good. And it is complete. He didn't have to squeeze it into every last minute of that week. He created it, and then it is enough. And so we are invited to rest, to practice the Sabbath, because God created and sustains the world, and the world that he created and sustained is enough. He finds it good, and so he invites us to find it good with him as well. Now contrast that with how our modern world thinks about the origins of the universe, just for a second. Our modern world looks at the origin of the universe and we see a cosmic accident and perpetual conflict. Everything kind of came through some sort of explosion. We can't quite figure out the other end of it. But what happened since then is what Charles Darwin called the survival of the fittest. Is that there's constant conflict from different organisms and animals, and whoever is the strongest or whoever is able to get the most, they eventually are the ones that we now see through the evolutionary process. The world is just built around accidents and conflict. And we've now taken that and we've applied that to our social world, right? Where I need to get ahead. I need to be more productive than the next guy. I need to continue to strive and to work. And so we've applied Darwinism now to our productivity and to our bottom lines and to how we think about and interact with people in our neighborhoods. You see, the productivity-driven world that we live in is actually a reflection of a belief about the origin of the universe. And so in the same way, our Sabbath keeping, right, when we take time to stop and to rest and to worship God and to enjoy life with Him, is actually our theology, our belief about God embodied in our rhythms and our calendar. That when I stop for an entire day and the world around me keeps striving and running and hurrying, that my stopping is actually demonstrating that I believe in a God who created, and in a God who created a world of enough. I mean, could it be that that's the best witness to the world that God created, and that you believe that there's a creator God, right? You don't have to get in an argument about science. Maybe you just need to stop and allow your neighbor to see you stopping and resting, and they're going to be like, what? I want some of that. And you can say, yeah, come follow the God that I've found in the pages of the Bible. There's a Jewish scholar named Abraham Joshua Heschel. He has this beautiful little book called The Sabbath. And he makes this note that in most ancient Near Eastern creation stories, on the last day or the last movement of that creation, whatever the deity was, right? There are lots of deities that they believe in the ancient Near East. That deity would do two things. It would place its image somewhere on the earth, and it would build a temple somewhere on the earth. So that you would go to that place and you would see the image of that God, and then you could worship that God in that temple, whatever that temple was. And he makes the point that what do we see the God of the Bible do in Genesis 1 and 2? The first thing that he does is he places his image in his creation. And what is that image? You and me. Not a statue, not a picture, not a photograph, living, breathing human beings and human souls. But the second thing he points out is this God in the Old Testament, in Genesis 1 and 2, does not build a temple in his creation. He instead builds a day in his creation. He says we meet God and we worship God not in space, but in time. And his point is this, like space can be conquered, space can be controlled, right? Space, you could live far away from that space or you could live close to that space, but time comes to everyone. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are, how smart or dumb you think you are, whether you're close to that place or far from that place. The Sabbath is what he called a cathedral in time, where on that day, 1 out of every 7 days, we are invited to sit in the presence of God on this day that he set apart for us to meet with him. And so the invitation of Sabbath, the gift of Sabbath, is to remember and to re-enter into relationship with this God 1 out of every 7 days. Second aspect of this gift from the Sabbath keeping reconnects us to how God created us to live. It reconnects us to how God created us to live. The first time that the Sabbath is commanded is in Exodus chapter 20. It's on the heels of God rescuing Israel from slavery in Egypt. And so at Mount Sinai, this is where God gives the Big Ten, the 10 Commandments. And the Sabbath is the fourth one of those commandments. And here's what it says. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who's within your city gates. Here's why. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. You see, the point there is that the Sabbath, this rhythm of 1 day out of every 7 days, is a rhythm that is built into how the world was created to work. Right? Like we don't read Genesis 1 and we don't say, okay, it says God created the sea animals. You're like, I don't believe in sea animals. He created the land animals. I don't believe in land animals. You say, he created the stars. Some of us would be like, I don't believe in stars, right? Depending on how deep into conspiracy theory you go. But oftentimes, we look at this and say, okay, yeah, God created land animals, he created us, he created everything that is, but it also tells us that God created this day called the Sabbath. And he invites us to experience it. This is actually built into the natural rhythm of how we were made to live. That we were not made to live constantly running and going, but that when we stop every 7 days, we are actually participating in the rhythm that God created us to live in. Marva Dawn, in her book on the Sabbath, she notes this. She says, other civilizations have tried 4, 5, 6, 8, and even 10-day weeks, But no pattern other than a 7-day week has persisted through time. The 7-day week was common for Babylonians, Egyptians, Persians, Indians, Chinese, Malays, Germans, Greeks, and Cherokee Native Americans. The world has discovered that a 7-day week matches our inmost being. In fact, there was a study done a couple years ago of Seventh-day Adventists, which is a religious organization, religious movement that practices the Sabbath. They've always practiced the Sabbath. And what they found is people within this movement live on average 10 years longer than the average American. And if you do the math, this is super fascinating, like it's really weird. If you do the math, if you were to practice the Sabbath every week for an entire lifetime, it would add up to about 10 years. So like if you want to live longer, the simple fact of it is like you practice the Sabbath. All right, think about those 10 years that you would have. An additional 10 years, you think, I got to get everything done this week. What about 10 years added onto your life? Right, because we were not made, like when we work at this constant pace, it wears on our bodies. Like we were made, we were created in order to practice this rhythm of work and rest. Third aspect of this gift, Sabbath keeping resists the oppressive and exploitative side of economics. Sabbath keeping resists the oppressive and exploitative side of economics. The second time the Ten Commandments are reiterated, they appear in Deuteronomy chapter 5. A whole generation has passed, and they are on the edge of the promised land. Right? They are about to finally experience what it is that God wants them. Although He's promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of houses and grapevines, a land where grapes are bigger than the palm of your hand. Like it is going to be wealth and comfort and all the things that they have longed for while they wandered the desert. But in this second 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, God adds a phrase to His commandment about the Sabbath. He says this, "You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God," just like it was in Exodus 20. "Do not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, any of your livestock, or the resident alien who lives within your city gates, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do." That's new. "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. This is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." See, what He's saying is this: you're going to get into the promised land, and the tendency is that you are going to move towards exploitation, that you're going to get comfortable. You're going to be top dog in this land, and your tendency, if you are not careful, is that you're going to build your wealth and privilege on the back of people who are different than you. You're going to bring people in to do your work for you. But He says, no, the Sabbath is for everyone. It's not a matter of just being a little bit better or a little bit higher on the org chart or the economic scale. The Sabbath is for everyone. And so the Sabbath is a way that God places in front of the people of Israel so that they do not become like Egypt. In Egypt, they were slaves to Pharaoh's empire, and God is warning them, if you get into this place, it's going to be comfortable and privileged. It's going to be very easy for you to become just like Pharaoh, only now in the promised land. But He says the difference for you is that when you are in this land, you are going to practice the Sabbath, and so is everyone else. From the top to the bottom, all the way down to your animals, everyone is going to rest. You see, the point is this: rest is not a reward for work or economic privilege. Right? Rest is not just for those who worked hard and finally earned a retirement or finally earned a vacation. Rest is not just for those who have enough set aside so that they can actually take a break from work. Rest is for everyone. Our world tends to see rest as like the reward. I finally earned enough. I can finally get that retirement. I can finally go to that place. I can finally get that house. But in God's world, in God's economy, rest is not a reward. It is an invitation for every single person. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, Sabbath as Resistance, here's what he says: "The Sabbath rest of God is the acknowledgement that God and God's people in the world are not commodities to be dispatched for endless production, and so used in the service of a consumer economy. Rather, they are subjects situated in an economy of neighborliness." That's the invitation of the Sabbath. See, with the rise of productivity in our world, it also coincides with the rise of advertising in our world. Right? Like in the 40s and 50s, we were producing so much that companies had to find new ways to get us to buy things, because things were now lasting longer than they used to. And so, you'd buy an oven or a stove and it would last forever, but you can't build a company off that. And so they created advertising. And what advertising does now is advertising is not about meeting needs, it's about creating desires. And so I watch an ad and it makes me think, oh, I need that, when I never would have thought I need that on my own. Right? It stokes this desire in me for more and more and more. And that more and more leads to having to produce more and consume more and buy more. And this is our whole economics. Most of our economy is built around consumerism, where I'm buying things that I probably don't need. But the reality is all of that is built on a whole shadow side that happens where we can't see it on the other side of the world. In fact, in statistics from 2022, the U.S. Department of Labor said that there are around 160 million children laborers in the world. That there are 28 million men, women, and children who are working what they call exploitative conditions in child slavery. And all of this is often at the beginning of our economics. Right? We don't see it. Right? I see the phone that I buy at the fancy Apple store. But at the beginning of how that phone came to be, or whatever the thing is, the TV or the car, is oftentimes exploitative labor practices. In fact, right now, one of the worst conditions of this is cobalt mines in the Congo, where children are going into mines to gather minerals that then are shipped to China. And in China, they are turned into lithium-ion batteries, and those lithium-ion batteries end up in our mobile devices and in our cars. And sometimes you look at that, and it's a lot easier to just not look at that and to just look at the storefront, or look at the advertisement, or look at my Amazon cart. But the Sabbath is an invitation to do a small part in resisting that. Right? Where once every 7 days, I resist the constant stream of desire-making in the economic system around me. Once every 7 days, I say no to buying and selling. Once every 7 days, I rest and I stop. And you think, okay, what difference does that make? But if we all did that, and if once every 7 days we stopped and we resisted the tendency for work and economics to become exploitative and oppressive, that would have an impact. If nothing else, it would curate something in us where I can say no. And I can ask the hard questions about why is it that I'm buying this now when maybe I don't need to? Why is it that I'm getting the instant gratification of purchasing and getting it shipped to my door the next day? Maybe I need to think harder about this. That's what the practice of the Sabbath causes us to do. It causes us to slow down and to think twice about the world that we live in that is forming us into mindless consumers. Instead to say, what if God's economy was actually working here? What if Sabbath invites me into neighborliness, where I live locally and I share things locally rather than this whole global economic exploitative system? Right? It's not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but it's something. And it's one step that we can take to resist the ways in which we are formed by that world around us. So Sabbath is a default way for us to resist and to curate our desires. Fourthly, Sabbath keeping reenacts the gospel of grace. Sabbath keeping reenacts the gospel of grace. Paul says this in Ephesians 2, "For you are saved by grace through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is God's gift, not from works, so that no one can boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared ahead of time for us to do." Sabbath keeping is grace moving from my head to my body to my calendar. We believe that we are saved by grace, which means I don't earn my position with God. I don't work hard enough to overcome my sin. I don't strive hard enough for God to get my attention. We believe that in our heads, and we believe that in our theology, but oftentimes our calendar and our schedule and our bodies believe that we are still justified by our work and our energy and our productivity. And so when I take time to stop and to rest every 7 days, I am teaching my body and my calendar that my belonging with God is based on grace and not work. That I don't have to earn anymore to get God's favor. I don't have to strive anymore to overcome the sin that's in my life. That I can rest and trust the completed work of Jesus on my behalf. And maybe, just maybe, dare to believe that God actually wants me to enjoy him. Right? That God just is not just a moral task list follower, but he actually wants me to rest and enjoy what he has accomplished for me. And what better way to do that than to stop and to rest and to worship him and to enjoy life with him. And so Sabbath, when I practice the Sabbath, it is me teaching myself and those around me that I belong because of the grace of Jesus and nothing more, and that is enough. Lastly, Sabbath keeping rehearses Jesus' eternal kingdom. Sabbath keeping rehearses Jesus' eternal kingdom. The writer of Hebrews says this, "Therefore a Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. For the person who has entered his rest has rested from his own works, just as God did from his. Let us then make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience." See, what he's saying is our Sabbath practice right now is a foretaste of the Sabbath that is waiting for us when Jesus' kingdom comes in its fullness. I mean, just think about what heaven is in your imagination. For a lot of us, we have a very thin view of heaven. What's heaven going to be like? I don't know, like babies, harps, robes on clouds. That's not a biblical view of heaven. That's a Greek view of heaven. Right? The biblical view of heaven is fully embodied life with God. Right? You get to the end of Revelation, and what is it that's happening? We are not going up to God. God is coming down here to us. The dwelling place of God is with man, is how the story ends. There's a feast that Jesus hosts for all of his people. Right? And that's not a feast of like imaginary food. That's like real food. Right? It is a fully embodied existence that you and I are going to have. And what is that life going to be like? It is going to be a Sabbath rest with God. That we're going to sit at his feet. We're going to enjoy life with him. He's going to wipe every tear from our eyes. He's going to meet every single one of our needs. That is what heaven is going to be like. And so imagine if once every 7 days, you had the opportunity to taste that, to sample that. Right? Think about a sample. The sample, right? I go to Sam's Club, I get samples. Right? It's something, you get a taste of it, and then you're like, I want more of that. Right? That's what Sabbath is when you practice it once every 7 days. Is every 7 days you come to this day and you stop working and you rest and you worship God and you enjoy the good gifts that he has given you, and you think, this is what's waiting for me. I want that day. I want it, and I want it now. But I'm going to trust Jesus now in this space as I practice the Sabbath. He's going to grow my desire for him and his things. That's why Rabbi Heschel said this, unless one learns to relish the taste of Sabbath, one will be unable to enjoy the taste of eternity in the world to come. And if you can't learn to rest and to be still and to enjoy life now, you're not going to like when the kingdom comes. Because that's what we're going to be doing. Resting at the feet of Jesus, celebrating his completed work, and enjoying the goodness of his presence and his gifts. So you might be thinking, that's all great. I want that. I'm too busy, right? I've got kids. I can't go to my boss on Tuesday and say, you know what, I want the 32-hour work week. I need to practice Sabbath, right? It's hard. The reality is, that sounds great. We love that in theory, but how do you actually put that into practice? How do you actually begin to experience and open up this gift that is the Sabbath? There's 4 things that we're going to look at in depth next week that I want to just give you to think about as we anticipate next week. All right, the 4 things that we do to step into the practice of Sabbath. The first is that we stop working. We stop working. We stop our paid and our unpaid work. All right, paid work, that's for many of us obvious. I go to work, or I log into work, or I'm on for my work. I come home, I'm off for work. But also unpaid labor is all the chores and the to-do list that fills our lives. I got to mow the lawn, I got to fix the house, I got to bathe the kids, I got to do all those things. We cease all of the to-dos that are about productivity and progress. For many of us, this means we need to stop checking our email. We probably need to stop answering some phone calls or some text messages. Even our mental processes about work, we need to work on stopping those, right? Because we all know you can be not on the clock at work, but your brain is running. And so we stop work. Second, then, is we rest. And this is a complete rest. This is a rest of our bodies. This is a rest of our minds. It's a rest of our worries. For many of us, it needs to be a rest from our devices and the constant barrage of notifications. For many of us, this should involve more sleep than you get the other 6 days of the week to rest your body. Third is then worship God. Sabbath is different than how our culture thinks of Saturday. All right, Saturday is a day, if you have a typical 9 to 5, where I get everything done. I mow the lawn, I can do the groceries, I get the chores, I make progress on a house project, whatever I'm doing. That's what we tend to think of as a Saturday. But a Sabbath is not a day off, it's a day on with God. And so it's a day where we spend in awareness of and slowing down to be attentive to God and his work in our world. That's why for many of us, Sabbath should overlap to some degree or another with a worship gathering like this. Because it tunes our hearts and our minds and our bodies back into the rhythm that God has for us in our world and in our life. But it means more than that. Right? That Sabbath is not just the hour and a half between when the first beat of music starts and when the benediction ends the service. That is a part of Sabbath, but Sabbath is also about worshiping God in your everyday life. About actually considering that he's with you outside of the walls of the church or the worship gathering, but he's actually with you in your everyday life. And so things like practicing silence and solitude, like we talked about a couple weeks ago. Practicing slowing down and being present with him through scripture and through prayer. All of these are practices that we can incorporate into Sabbath. But lastly, and perhaps the most scandalous of all, is that we are invited to enjoy life with God. That God actually wants us to enjoy life with him. That he wants us to, once every 7 days, most of us live like this. I'm grabbing onto everything. I'm holding on to control. I'm squeezing everything I can get out of life. On Sabbath, we let go, and with open hands, we receive the gifts that God has for us. Not just the gifts that we think of as spiritual gifts, but the gifts of food and friendship, the gift of time with your kids, the gift of nature and taking time to slow down, the gift of intimacy with your spouse, the gift of good coffee instead of whatever the coffee is that they have in the office. It's an invitation to actually enjoy. Like God created a world in which he gave us 5 senses to experience it. And so on Sabbath, we slow down so that we can actually experience all that God has for us. A foretaste of what is coming. And so we're going to explore that more next week in detail. What does it look like for you? I'm going to give some suggestions, some practical thoughts for how to actually incorporate this. But here's what I want you to do in just this next week. All right. There's probably, as you look at your calendar, right, get together with whoever's in your household. As you and a spouse, maybe you and a spouse, and kids who are able to understand scheduling, right, which I don't know what age that is yet. Get together and say, okay, when could we, in our week, have 24 hours of Sabbath? Now, here's the thing. None of us have this already, unless you are practicing Sabbath already. None of us, if you look at your calendar, you say, you know what? Oh, yeah, I do have 24 hours in which I'm doing nothing. Right? All of us, right, have something that is going to fill that time. But together as a family or as a couple or as an individual, to sit down and look at your week and say, when could I put brackets around a 24-hour period of time to stop work, to rest, to worship God, and to enjoy life with him? Now, there's going to be 3 different things that you need to do. All right, 3 different categories of things. They're going to be up here on the screen. There's going to be some things that you need to stop. There's going to be some things that you just need to stop doing. Maybe that's checking email. Maybe that's mowing the lawn. Maybe that's scheduling certain appointments on that day. There's going to be some things that you just need to say, there's no way that this can really fit into Sabbath because it is work, it's productivity, it causes me tremendous amounts of stress. And so there's some things that I just need to say, I need to just stop this. There's going to be other things that you probably need to move, if you can move them. To say, okay, if this is going to be our 24 hours, I still need to do this, but how can I move it to someplace else in the week? How can I move this to before Sabbath so that we're ready for Sabbath when it comes? How can I move this to after Sabbath or fit this in some other time during the week so that I can be present here in this space? There's going to be a third category, and those are things that you can't move, that don't quite fit into work. So the question is going to be, how can I do this differently? Right? Like if you are a parent with kids who are of any age around activities, right, most of that's probably going to fall on the weekend. And so you might think, okay, taking my kid to soccer practice, that is work. But I can't say, all right, get yourself to soccer practice. I'm Sabbathing. I mean, maybe you could do that, but that probably would go a little weird, right? You can't tell your infant, I'm Sabbathing, I can't change your diaper today. But there are ways, if you are thoughtful about it and prayerful about it, to say, I can do this differently. Where yes, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it not from a posture of anxiety or stress or trying to prove something or productivity, but rather doing this as a gift and as an invitation to be present. We're going to explore that a whole lot more next week as we talk about these three categories and what it looks like for you to do these four things in the practice of Sabbath. And over the course of this week, as you look at those three categories, you're probably going to have some questions or some tensions or some things that are going to come up, which is why next week we're doing our Q&R. We're going to answer some questions and respond to a few things that you're feeling in this practice. And so as that happens this week, send the text, and I will do my best to respond to it next week as we seek to then live into this life together of resting and trusting God to provide for us. So I want to end us just with an invitation from Scripture. So if you would, just take a moment. We've talked about a lot. Close your eyes for just a second. I'm just going to read this short quote from Jesus. We've read it a couple times in this series, but I think it's relevant. I want you to just receive this word from Jesus, and then I want you to just take a moment, and I want you to just note what's one thing that God wants me to take home today. One thing that God wants me to take home today. I'm just going to give you a minute to reflect, to pray, to be present before we turn our hearts and our minds to what's next. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Come to me, Jesus said, all you who are weary, heavy burdened, and I will give you rest.